Well, welcome to the Building Podcast. Now, today we have the pleasure of talking to a doyen of the construction industry. Rudi Klein has spent a lifetime advocating for change and improvement within our sector. And I'm really looking forward to a wide-ranging conversation that will touch on many of the sector pinch points. Rudi, welcome to the Building Podcast.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Great. Well, Rudi, look, we normally start off by giving you an opportunity just to tell our listeners and viewers as to what you've been up to and what you're involved in the industry and what you're up to now, so that we get a chance of understanding sort of the context of some of the discussions we're about to have.
Well, that question about what I've been up to, that's a very loaded question, Mark.
I know it is.
we are obviously talking in relation to construction. Well, I've had involvement with the construction industry probably for getting on for 40 years or so. I started out as a barrister, then by sheer accident became involved in construction law because I was instructed on arbitration. Of course, we forgot about arbitrations now, we don't talk about them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's how I became involved with construction. I also have taught construction law in a variety of institutions, including foreign universities. So that's a little bit of where I came from. And then for about 33 years or so, I was chief executive of the Specialist Engineering Contractors Group. And for those listening who perhaps don't know what the SEC Group, as it's called, did, well, we represented the interests of probably the largest value of work in the construction industry. In other words, we represent the interests of specialist engineering firms which deliver high value inputs to the industry, from steel, MEP, lifts, and so on. So quite a large organisation. We were based throughout the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. In fact, we had SEC Groups Wales, SEC Group Northern Ireland, SEC Group Scotland. And we had quite a focus actually on certain number of priorities, which included payment, procurement, trying to professionalise the industry, improve competence, and so on. And that was what we did. And a lot of our work was parliamentary work. In other words, we developed relationships with parliamentarians, ministers, civil servants, and we spent a lot of our time getting involved in legislation, drafting amendments to legislation, and of course one of the big things that we were involved with was the Construction Act, not in its origins but also when it was amended, and we influenced the content of that act to a fairly large degree. Talking about the Construction Act, I also provided to the Irish government the initial draft of the Irish Construction Contracts Act, which became law in 2013. But we've also developed many other initiatives around health and safety, procurement, and so on. So in a nutshell, Mark, I could probably go on for a bit longer, but I won't. That's been the background. But I think what I would finish by saying is that I think payment has been the focus of certainly my own efforts.
No, well, I think, Rudi, your time at the SEC Group, you got involved in virtually every aspect of the industry and various the touch points on how your members needed to have their life improved. And so I think, you've been involved and seen most of the challenges we have within the sector. And I know you were heavily involved in the understanding the Building Safety Act as far as that goes. But let's start with payment to start with, because it's still a key issue. We've had the demise of ISG at the end of last year. And do you want to just sort of give us sort of thing, why is fair payment so crucial within our sector, and what are the challenges we've really got to cope with?
Well, yeah, I mean, on a personal level, over those years, I have seen the misery that is associated with payment abuse. Um, and and I have to say that's always has troubled me, because over those years, you get phone calls from people in firms, many of which are small businesses, who are beside themselves because they haven't got their attention or they haven't been paid, and they really don't know where to go. They can't afford legal representation, and they used to ring me up because we were fairly high profile on these issues, and I couldn't really spend all my time dealing with these queries as much as I would have liked to. But I'll never forget one case, actually, many years ago. And I went to the Court of Appeal. Actually, it was about an electrical installation company based in Essex, and there were four brothers involved, and they were suing Honeywell, very big company, to recover outstanding payments that were primarily generated through variations, and they had to go to the Court of Appeal in the end, to get some justice. But in the meantime, one of the directors committed suicide. And on a more personal level, my own brother, who has been involved in business all his life, set up his own business without really anything in terms of cash, but did start his own business, risky thing. But I always remember spending a whole day with him because he wasn't being paid, and he had completely lost it. He had about 20 employees, and I was really fearful for him. So I think the mental health impact of poor payment is so widespread out there, and that does trouble me immensely, as it should everybody else, actually. But there's also, you mentioned, Mark, building safety. Dame Judith Hackett, in a 2018 report on builder safety, didn't pull any punches when she said poor payment practices compromise building safety, whether it's not releasing retentions when they should, or even the fact the retention system itself didn't really help. But payment abuse generally compromised building safety. And of course, there's the more wider impact, which is the growth in the industry. If you could imagine, Mark, if people over the years that I've been involved would pay the right amount, at the right time, I mean, look at how this industry would have grown. I mean, what was amazed was a figure that came out of the government inquiry into retentions. Independent report was produced by Pi Tate. It came out in October 2017, and that actually says £1 million per working day was being lost because of upstream insolvencies. That's £1 million worth of retentions was being lost because of upstream insolvencies. And I say, when you think about how much the industry would have been better off if everybody got paid when they should and the right amount, then it would be a different industry today. And it's interesting, Mark, that you're having this podcast, because we're in 2025, believe it or not. And you might recall that there was a document that was produced 12 years ago called Construction 2025.
I was involved in it, Rudi.
You were.
I think my name's on the back of it. Absolutely.
Yes, that's right. You were. And that said, and made it very, by 2025, the industry will be transformed. Payment malpractices will be a thing of the past.
It wasn't quite worded like that, but that was certainly the intention.
I'm paraphrasing. But but it was supposed to be transformational. And then, of course, we had another initiative, which is really an attempt to block progress on protecting retention monies a few years ago. We had another initiative that came from an organisation which I think was called Build UK, which is dominated by the very large contractors. They said, by 2025, it will be the end of retentions. We'll have a roadmap to get rid of retentions by 2025. Well, and then that was adopted by the government's Quango, the Construction Leadership Council. And I've not seen much sign, I don't know about you, but I've not seen much sign of retentions disappeared. If anything, in fact, given the financial stresses on the industry, retentions, in fact, are more prevalent than ever.
Well, really, I mean,
I saw one contract, Mark, the other day, which said, oh, by the way, your retentions, they will in law now belong to us. Because legally, retentions are monies that belong to the party that actually provides them or from whom they're withheld. But this contract said, no, they all belong to us being the lead contractor. So I know it's a long way of trying to deal with your question, but I just think over the years we've done a lot to try and deal with the problem, but the problem still persists.
So why do you think that's the case, then, Rudi? I mean, you're absolutely right that that the implications of withholding money are drastic from both personal and from a corporate position for the supply chain.
Yeah.
But why is it such an intractable problem? Why can't it be solved, given the obvious benefits to everybody, including building safety, but also you and I know about the improvements in collaboration and improvements in working practices on site if you get the payment and take payment out of the equation. So what is it that's actually causing this problem? Why can't we solve it?
Well, I think obviously business models has been one of the reasons that the predominant business model in the industry, and I'm not just talking about the large contractors, even some of the large firms in the supply chain as well, that the prevailing business model is to sublet everything and pass the risk of non-payment into the supply chain, and that's been, say, the dominant business model, where value at the top end is not really being delivered. It's being delivered in the supply chain, meaning that the supply chain, of course, has to do the necessary investment to deliver the value. And Carillion, of course, was a typical example of this, wasn't it? That really never did any of the work. I remember one BBC journalist asking me when Carillion went bust, well, what about all these people who are wearing Carillion, shirts on them, or safety waistcoats on them? And I said, well, no, that's all their subcontractors. They're told to wear them because Carillion never did any of the work. And they complained that the returns were so small. They're only getting 1% returns. And I mean, if I was getting 1% return on capital, not my capital, but that I've invested, but 1% return on capital, I'm actually holding on, belonging to other people, I would be flipping delighted.
Yeah.
And that's been, I say, that business model that has evolved over the years has been a very difficult one to dislodge. And I mean, although the government in various reports over the years have said, oh, that the business model for the industry is broken, they've really not done enough to address it. And more lately, one of the reasons they haven't done really much to address it, I mean, for example, they never did anything on retentions, was because they were fearful that we'd have another Carillion. So they are worried about the financial position and balance sheets of these very large companies. But it's strange, isn't it, that, as you will well know, Mark, I'm not telling anything new here, but I've witnessed it, that if you're in the supply chain, you're a successful business in the supply, your balance sheet often tends to be far, far better and healthier than the company up the top there that's actually letting the work out.
Yeah.
So I think that for the most part has been the problem. But I don't want to be absolutely negative here, because there have been attempts, I know, on a smaller scale, to address these problems. And a lot of regional contractors, for example, have been very good at working with their supply chains, sharing risk with their supply chains. We also had, I mentioned the Construction Act early on. That has helped to some extent because it introduced a process for helping payment and ensuring that there was a debt that was crystallised at the end of the payment process. Of course, it introduced rights of suspension, non-payment, and adjudication, although that's become rather expensive these days. Then there were project bank accounts. I mean, the project bank account thing has worked, but the opposition to it, well, you can imagine who that came from. I mean, two of the leading exponents of this were Mace and Langer, who argued with government when the government's construction playbook was being developed. This is the government's Bible for procurement. They argued that project bank accounts should be extinguished and shouldn't have a place in the playbook. Now, interestingly, well, the managing director of Mace is now chair of the Construction Leadership Council, which is particularly worrying. But project bank accounts have worked, and as you aware, Mark, you and I have had some involvement in working with a small fintech company, Sable, to try and digitize the process and make it much easier. But nonetheless, I've had countless reports from firms who've worked with project bank accounts in the supply chain who said, yeah, it's gratifying to know that our monies are protected. Highways, national highways, for example, use them now, have used them on about £20 billion worth of highways work. And they pay their supply chain within 19 days from the assessment date under the main contract. I mean, this is good stuff, but the Cabinet Office has been lethargic in driving this. I mean, initially when it came out, they weren't. Now they've been very lethargic in driving the PBA initiative, and it should be driven, because I think it is a way forward. And if the process is digitized, so for example, you don't have to set up a PBA every time you have a project, then I think we'll see a lot of improvement. So there are possibilities for improvement. We just simply lack the will to deliver it, mainly as driven by concerns relating to our business models, particularly the business models for larger companies.
Yes, I mean, I think really the business model is the one that I think we have to focus on. I mean, I think the project bank account is a solution to ease the payment through and actually secures that payment for everybody. But by and large, I think one of the challenges we have is that the supply chain cash is much cheaper than borrowing from the bank, and doesn't appear on your balance sheet that you're borrowing the cash. And I think there are better ways of presenting that in accounts and audits that show that, if we're paying people on 90 days and we're being paid on 30 days, there's 60 days worth of cash in the business which doesn't belong to us.
Yeah,
will have to be repaid. Now that under current arrangements, it effectively is an invisible loan that is interest free at the moment, and that perhaps is something we ought to pick up on the accounting metrics, because that's you can understand why companies are doing this because it's free. Getting back from it is very difficult.
You're absolutely right, and of course, when you think about it, this then adds to the cost of construction, because the cost of borrowing for a lot of firms, if they can borrow, a lot of firms in the supply chain can be quite horrendous, and that somehow over time has to be priced in, otherwise they will go down under, and often they do. So yeah, I mean, I think that accounting issue is something that needs to be addressed. But I just think when we look back on what's gone on over the years, you take retentions, for example. I mean, when Carillion went bust, there were about £750 million worth of retentions that went up in smoke. Now, a hell of a lot of money. I mean, Carillion was actually taking retentions from the supply chain when they weren't being asked for retentions upstream. I mean, I know, for example, this happened on the Faslane submarine base that Carillion was working on at the time, and the MOD wasn't asking for retentions, but Carillion was actually demanding retentions down the supply chain, and that does happen actually quite a lot. So it's a source, isn't it, as you rightly say, is retentions or free cash. Now, all of a sudden we had 5-6 years ago, we had the likes of Build UK that is run by the large contractors. They have one vote each. Compared to their trade association members, even though they might have hundreds of members, they also have one vote. So the large contractors have one vote, so they tend to dominate. But they've decided, they told the government, oh well, we can get rid of retentions. Well, that was a kind of populist cry, because I knew at the time that was not going to happen. And I drafted the bill, the retentions bill, that was then presented to Parliament by Peter Aldous MP. I don't think he's the MP any longer, but anyway, he presented that to Parliament. But in fact, that bill had the support of almost half of the House of Commons, but it didn't progress because of all the shenanigans around Brexit. So, but we wanted the government to adopt the bill. But they set their minds against it. Oh, so there was no consensus in the industry.
But Rudi, I mean, the retentions have been on the list for many years. I mean, I sat on the JCT 20 years ago, and retention. We discussing taking retentions out of the JCT contract at that time.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges I put to our industry is that we wait for government to set the scene. Why we don't solve our own problems? Now, I know the government's the largest client, but why isn't the industry solving a problem like this? Okay, we're run by the major contractors at the CLC. I understand that, which is meant to be the pan-industry body. But we ought to be in a position where we can solve our own problems rather than relying on everybody else to input into how we solve our own problems.
Well, yeah, I mean that's been though over the years a fairly common refrain, Mark. I mean, it's even come from government. But I think, we've got to be honest here. We're incapable of solving our own problems. We're absolutely incapable. I mean, you and I, and many others have views, very clear views of what needs to be addressed. But there isn't the kind of movement in the industry. There isn't the community in the industry that's together, sufficiently together to be able to impress their views and take matters forward. We're a very divided industry, a very fragmented industry, and as you and I both know, a lot of the businesses are very small businesses, and trying to generate some feelings out there, generate some action out there across all those firms is difficult. The nearest I think we came to it, though, having said that, was when we got a lot of support for the retentions bill out there in the industry, a tremendous amount of support, and that's because it was one issue that affected everybody. Although in the end it didn't help us because the government wasn't intent to address it. I just think that our representation at the moment is weak as an industry. There are a lot of trade associations out there that all have their own separate agendas. Sometimes those agendas don't always match what the members want, but they all have the different agendas. And then we have the government looking to a construction and leadership council that is, in fact, a quango government. It's run by the business department. I was hoping they would get rid of it with the new government. That hasn't happened so far. And that pretends that it leads the industry. It doesn't lead the industry anywhere. And I just feel sometimes, I feel quite frustrated by this, that on maybe issues, maybe around payment, maybe procurement, that there is a need for a widespread movement in the industry. I mean, you're the chairman of the National Federation of Builders, representing the regional contractors. I think there's scope for developing a broad movement in the industry. It does. Somebody or some organisation needs to sort of take leadership, other than that it won't get anywhere. But a broad movement throughout the industry that is only directed towards fighting on 2 or 3 fronts, and that's it. And one of those, of course, being payment, the other perhaps procurement, and focusing on that. But I think a movement out there in the industry does need to be generated. And it might then, to some extent, that might meet what you're saying. This is coming from the industry, because when you think about it, I mean, the likes of, government deals with the likes of Build UK, they don't represent the industry. They represent a few of the, say, large contractors. So there is scope for doing that. But it does require an initiative from 1 or 2 organisations, rather than perhaps individuals, to get this moving with a very, very clear agenda. But we don't have, the kind of representation that, for example, the car industry has, where it's much more focused, and they're quite effective. They are reported regularly in the national press.
There's far fewer manufacturers, aren't there, and providers in the car industry. It's a far smaller sector. Let me ask you a different question, which is sort of a bit more personal question on this. I mean, I think one of the challenges we have in the sector is that the industry got taken aback 25 years ago with the anti-collusion tendering, where lots of contractors, particularly main contractors, were caught out in collusive tendering, and that, in my view, prevented collaboration across the sector stone dead. We were absolutely told by everybody you weren't allowed to talk to anybody on anything. And effectively, collaboration, I saw it myself, collaboration across the trade bodies died because we were scared of saying anything to anybody. And I think that's we've been living with the repercussions of that for many, many years.
I think you have a point there, Mark. It does cause problems. I mean, it causes problems, of course, within trade associations, because trade associations members, when they gather together, they obviously have to be careful. I mean, I still attend trade association meetings as a lawyer, and one of the reasons I'm often asked to attend is to make sure that the problem that you've highlighted isn't present.
Yes.
So it is still a problem. But I think when it comes to collaboration, I mean, after all, you mentioned the Building Safety Act. The Building Safety Act now demands collaboration. It's a legal requirement.
Yeah.
But and as long as the collaborative effort is transparent and open, so that everybody really knows what is going on, because that's what collaboration is actually about. It's actually about transparency. In fact, is the antithesis of the kind of practices that you were highlighting. So it's the way that I think people kind of misinterpreted perhaps what collaboration really should be about.
Yeah.
But I do agree. I think it did have for some time an impact on the preparedness of people really to work close together. And the other thing, Mark, it's not just that. The other problem, of course, has been the insurance industry, because insurers are very wary of people working too closely with each other, because of then, when you're then, if there is any liability, how do you unravel that liability? Who is responsible for what? And that has been also a problem for years and years and years. I mean, even though the problem we have, of course, insurance. I mean, when you think about all the types of insurance we've got in the industry, PI, contractors, all risk, they're all covering in respect to the same kind of risk. So we waste a lot of money on having separate policies of insurance, which is why something again you and I are both acquainted with, which is why initiatives like insurance-backed alliancing will help us with promoting collaboration. But insurance and the insurance industry hasn't been exactly as helpful as we'd like in trying to promote collaboration.
Yes, I mean, I think the insurance industry is like any other industry, isn't it? It needs to see the commercial advantage of doing things a different way. And certainly the alliance-backed insurance products that you and I are familiar with is something that I think has been shown to improve collaboration and improve client outcomes.
Yeah.
We just need to get more of it out there so that people understand and can use it and see it more. And it's still very much an unknown quantity as far as insurers are concerned. And from speaking of experience, trying to get insurers to look at it, it's a very difficult ask. Rudi, you talked about the Building Safety Act, and I'm aware of time, but is that are you optimistic about the cultural change that the Building Safety Act should be promoting through the industry? Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think we're going to improve the competence of people in the sector and the training that's required around that?
Yeah, I'm fairly confident, Mark. I mean, it's the first time we've had a regulator.
Yep.
In the industry, albeit the jurisdiction of this particular regulator perhaps is not as wide as like, but you might recall that in the report that was issued last September by the inquiry into the Grenfell fire, that report recommended a broader industry regulator, and I think that that is certainly desirable. But nevertheless, I think we have a building safety regulator. The only hesitation I have, and I probably sound a bit hesitant about it all, because when we look back over the initiatives over the years, when you look back at, we've had about 50 payment initiatives of one sort or reports, recommendations over the years, and nothing much has come out of them. It's the same with inquiries, but I'm hesitant with this, because what I'm fearful about is that a lot of firms will get fed up because all they will be seeing is paperwork, and that will add to their overheads, their costs, and they then can't really see any change coming about, even though they've incurred all this effort, become competent to do this paperwork. And when I say paperwork, I mean things are digital now, obviously, but paperwork is an easier thing to say. But I'm always remember when the CDM regulations came out in 1994. They did provoke a lot of paperwork, which is not, and as it goes down the supply chain, well, it's all chucked down the supply chain. There's no attempt to sift it out and make it relevant to whichever firm you're passing on in the supply chain. And so what you'll do, or what you do, is just simply get a deluge of stuff foisted on you, and you've got to work through what really is relevant to you. So my concern is that it will end up as a paper chase, with people not being able to see the bigger picture, or indeed see the results of this legislation. But having said that, there is a focus, very much a focus on competence. And what I remember, one of the things Sir John Egan said many years ago, when he did his report Rethinking Construction, he said that anybody can come into the construction industry. There's no barriers to entry. Anybody can do it, which is one of the reasons he was saying is why why funders steer clear of the industry. The city of London doesn't particularly engage with the industry because it just sees it as this amorphous mass of firms that come in, next minute they're out. Somebody else comes in, although you have these Phoenix companies, of course, coming in. They were bust a few weeks ago. Now they come up, they're different guys. So there certainly is a need to improve the industry's competence. There's a lot of focus on that. I am personally a favour of licensing. Now, in most states, United States, I did some research on this a few months ago because I've actually been working with Select, which is the Electrical Contractors Association of Scotland, on a bill for the Scottish Parliament on licensing electricians in Scotland. And as I was drafting that bill, I was looking at the position in the United States and doing some research into the approaches of the various 50 states of the United States and how they approach it, because it's very much a state issue. And the overwhelming majority of states either have legislation that requires firms to be competent and or individuals to be competent, such as plumbers, electricians. Some states require this anyway if you're dealing with the public sector. And in fact, I was advising not so long ago a firm that was planning to do some work in the US. I said, well, you're going to have to be licensed. It's going to take you a couple of years to probably get yourself licensed. And it's not just the states. I think Australia, states in Australia do this. And I think that is where we need to be working towards. And that will then give some professionalism to the industry, some value to the industry. And I think it'll put the industry on a far better footing than it is now. So in terms of competence, in terms of where the Act is now focused on, the regulator wants to sort of focus on, I think there certainly is a way to go. One other thing, Mark, I would say, competence, of course, is, organizational competence aside, corporate competence aside, competence about skills, knowledge, and experience. But there's also another factor in the legislation, behaviours. And there is a requirement in the legislation that you have the right behaviours. Now that's interesting. I've never seen that in legislation ever. And behaviours means that you've really got to ensure that your employees act in a way that's conducive to promoting building safety. So, for example, if they honestly feel that they don't have the competence to do things, those have to be that has to be revealed, has to be recorded, and so there's a need for honesty and transparency in terms of what you're capable of doing, and I think that could be quite helpful. So I think overall, I'm optimistic, as long as we don't end up with a deluge of paperwork, different questionnaires, non-standard questionnaires. We're getting already that will then gradually wear people out.
Well, I think there's another podcast to do on licensing, because I have done a small stint of work in the US, and all sorts of thoughts about how it can work and how it really shouldn't work. But that's for another time. You talked about the rise of paperwork that you're worried about on the Building Safety Act, and I'm aware of time, and we've had a good canter through all sorts of things. But one of my final questions is around the Construction Act. I wondered whether you thought that adjudication was up for a rewrite. It appeared to be doing as much work as if we were going to court for an adjudication, when it was meant to be brought in as fast, furious, and a relatively economic way of solving disputes on construction sites.
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised that, Mark, actually, because one of the things that I was going to mention, and I think your question provides some context to this. The government is talking about introducing fair payment legislation.
It is indeed. Yeah.
And I'm hoping that the government in that legislation will mandate the use of PBAs, mandate the need for retentions to be protected if they're used, because I believe if they are protected, then in the end you'll get rid of them because nobody can abuse them. And finally, I think the Construction Act needs to be amended, and that includes adjudication. I have been involved in adjudications, really representing clients. I I have to say, not all of them were seriously expensive. It has been a boost for small businesses, particularly. But what I'd like to see is that in legislation that there is a requirement that for claims under a certain amount that they are dealt with online. I don't know if you've heard of. There's a website, Money Claims Online, where if you're suing for a debt in the county court, you can do a lot of it online. I'd like to see adjudication online, where under a certain amount there are fixed fees. I mean, I know already, organisations like the Technology and Construction Court Solicitors Association have got a process for fixed fee adjudications under a certain value of claims. So I think this should be a must be done to make adjudication now accessible really to all small business, because that, as you will recall, that was what it was about in its origins. The other thing, Mark, connected with adjudication, why do we need all these adjudication procedures, for goodness sake? Let's have one single adjudication procedure. I mean, when I provided the initial draft of the Irish Construction Act, that's one thing I did, have one set procedure. There's now one set procedure for adjudication in Ireland. Why do we have to grapple with the different procedures, wondering whether these procedures are Act compliant or whether they're not Act compliant? And of course, if we've got doubts about whether they're Act compliant, that becomes then could well end up in court. We don't want any of that nonsense. So I do think adjudication needs to be amended. I think the payment process needs to be amended. We've got the silliness of notices, too many notices. Let's do, again, sorry to go back to the Irish Act, but when I was drafting that, I just simply said, you're the payee, put forward your claim within a certain time frame, and then that claim has to be paid, unless in the meantime then the other side wants to pay you less. But if they want to issue a notice that pays you less, that notice has got to be issued far earlier in the process, not the day before the final date for payment, as it is now. So I think there is some changes. I mean, the government, as you probably will recall, in 2018 or the end of 2017, they consulted on reform of the Construction Act as well as reform on retentions. And they didn't do anything about either at the time. And so I think this has got to be brought back in focus once the government starts considering what to do with late payment legislation. But there's anything I think we can do. And I send this out as a message really to all in the industry as well. Listen to this, that we really do need to get our act together if we're going to make sure that the agenda for this fair payment legislation is suitable to our needs. What we don't want is, we seem to be having codes all the time, more codes. We've got now a new fair payment code. We've got these payment reporting. I'm not against payment reporting, but the trouble is reporting the problem isn't fixing it.
We need solutions, don't we, Rudi? That's what we need. Simple, effective solutions.
Well, that's always a good note to finish on, Mark, isn't it?
Well, I was going to ask. I mean, you've been involved in all sorts of things, Rudi, over the many years. As you say, 40 years in the sector, fighting for your members on all sorts of issues. So as a brief summary, are you positive for the future? We've got at the moment we've got work is reducing down, but we know there's always going to be building work out there. We know we've got lots of people wanting to come into a really exciting industry, but probably need to do a bit more about in making that work. We've got some mental health issues we need to sort out, but the opportunities that our sector can provide anybody in these are fantastic. And I just wondered if you've got a sort of summary on the opportunities going forward that you can see.
Well, I that's a good question, Mark. Well, all your questions are good, but this one's even better. But I think that the future really, I think is good. I think it's a positive one, and the reason I say that, we are a bit backward at the moment, unlike other industries making use of AI and digitization. I think AI clearly is something we need to grasp. I mean, artificial intelligence is something we should be using a lot more in terms of risk, for example, in terms of design. And I know some firms are already trying to work with it, but it does require some investment, particularly in software and so on. But that's going to cut a cost. It's hopefully reduce some of the uh, uh, bad practice that we've been talking about. But it's going to make our lives a lot, or should make our lives a lot easier. When I say that sort of thing, I'm always mindful of the fact, like 50 years ago, they said, oh, well, computers is going to be that we're going to have, 3-day weeks. We don't have to work for the rest of the week. Of course, they didn't quite turn out like that, but nonetheless, I think AI is certainly a game changer, and will be a game changer once we are able to harness it. But its use, I think, is just, well, we know there's no end to it, and but it'll be a game changer for the industry if we pursued it and invested in it.
Yeah. Well, Rudi, I think it's an optimistic note to finish on. Thank you very much for a great canter through a lot of the issues that we've got, and I'm pleased to hear you've got some hope for the fair payment that's appeared in the Labour manifesto in the last year's election, which will be good news to see that coming through, and that you're optimistic about the effects of the Building Safety Act, which are the sort of two key areas which I think the next few years is going to crystallise around. But thank you very much for your time today. Wish you well in your legal services company that you're operating now.
Yeah.
And look forward to catching up with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was such a wonderful opportunity to be able to pursue some of these issues with somebody for whom I have great respect.
Thank you very much.